Hello, friends. Another privacy chat. Thanks to those of you who are taking a couple of minutes out of your day to join me, and a very special thank you to my special guest today, Jessica Lee of Loeb Loeb. Many of you know Jessica. If you work in privacy and data protection, you can't not. She represents lots of companies involved in many of the leading edge issues that we're all debating, and is out and about and visible, and somebody who we often turn to for a smart perspective, particularly on some of the more challenging issues. So happy 2022, and welcome to the show. It's sort of a show now, right? It is a show.
I feel like it's a show.
You know what? It's for many of us, it's actually Groundhog Day, because some of the issues that we are all debating are the same issue over and over and over and over, and probably no issue has been debated over and over and over more than online advertising. 20 years ago, when I was at DoubleClick, we were having the same exact conversation. Is this a wonderful thing that keeps content free and helps marketers, deliver ads in a way that is efficient, and that's why they're spending, money on it, and therefore there's a great new opening of economic activity? Or is it a terrible technique for surveillance, for consumer deception? I think the only new framing that has shown up around online advertising in the last couple of years is it a source for disinformation and for radicalizing? That was not what we were talking about back then, right? We were is it fair for someone to put this information on your computer, or to create a profile, or could it be used in a way that discriminates in terms of the offers, or somehow out you for your interest or preferences? And now we're talking about, is this undermining democracy, and is it radicalizing people and handing on COVID misinformation? So Groundhog Day, I don't know, do you have another movie title for the for sort of this never-ending debate about tech policy?
No, Groundhog Day is the best example out there. Or I was trying to think of one. It also feels like we're catching up, right? Like what pushed Europe forward on privacy was kind of with the rise of dictatorship, and I feel like we're experiencing, we'll call it dictatorship, but we're experiencing some of the symptoms of that. That tied up with some misinformation. I think that's also pushing our criticisms and pressure down on the advertising industry, because I think there are issues that we weren't thinking about before, back in the DoubleClick days, to your point.
Yeah, I think you've got an important point there, and I'd extend that to when Europeans or others in regimes that lived close to a history of communist neighbors, or of government surveillance. I think for a lot of folks in the U.S., despite the fact that we've got some of that history, you talk to tech entrepreneurs, and they're launching an app, or they've got some idea, and you say, but government could use this to spy on you, and to try to overthrow democratic will. They kind of, hey, I'm the startup, I'm just creating an app that lets you play a game, right? And post the last couple of years, I think anybody, right, reasonable, saw what was going on and said, well, wait a second, even though we have these democratic institutions where we think those things couldn't happen here, a president not leaving office, or ordering government agencies to spy on enemies, like that's a weird, horrible thing. Yes, that happened in history, but we don't have Hoover again. And then you were reminded that yes, the government spied and tried to blackmail Martin Luther King. The government spied, and do we have the right oversight? So I feel like even the entrepreneurial class is starting to get it, and you're not like a Luddite if you say to them, we really need laws because bad things can happen. And by the way, big companies, not just government, right? The other difference with Europe, I think, was often, well, we get it when it comes to government. We have rules and we all agree that the government needs to be, but come on, companies, it's just advertising, right? And did you, in dealing with clients, you sort of get a sense as well that, you're not a privacy, absolutist if you're actually saying to them now, this is actually important for society.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think for all of the criticisms of GDPR, I've heard people say, oh, it's the dog that didn't bite. And, I think it took time for us to see kind of fines rolling out. The thing happening behind the scenes is that it put privacy, I think, on the radar. And so that kind of had a snowball effect with, okay, now we're thinking more about privacy issues. We're more aware of those issues. We're seeing what's going on in the world, disinformation. So you're having this kind of wind up effect where, you don't get that same resistance internally. I think people get it. There are different levels or ranges of getting it, but I think you're not sort of out there raising a flag by yourself anymore.
Let's talk about Europe for a second. And obviously the big news of this week was the Belgian decision, which had gone through the EDPB process. So whether it's a European decision, obviously IAB Europe, is based in Brussels, but they're, co-controllers with, according to this decision, all of the users of the TCF, which is sort of everybody. And although some of the issues are specific to the IAB as a controller of that TCF string, clearly the bigger implication is that the core issues that the TCF is intended to solve, a system for websites to properly get consent and define purposes and communicate those, in a way that supports e-privacy and GDPR compliance, was quite clearly questioned. Whether or not there are individual country DPAs who maybe didn't object, but might not take the exact view over whether or not, I don't know, real-time bidding is now therefore illegal. Maybe it is a consensus Europe decision because of that process, but it's not an EDPB decision. And yes, people did object. So I think yet to be seen, but clearly the mechanism that companies are complying by has been hit with a huge blow. Is it fixable, I guess, is the big question. And I don't know the answer to that. Do you have some perspective on whether if the IAB was given a timetable to fix this? And I think they hope to. Is it fixable?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they've said, and that seems to be the hope. And there are definitely things in here that are fixable, right? Like the DPO and not having the records of products. There's some things on the outsides of this decision that are certainly fixable. But the joint controllership, I think a lot of that can be addressed. But I think the core issue is, can you find an appropriate lawful basis for the processing of personal information in open RTB? And if the decision is legitimate interest isn't sufficient or can't be used because the balancing test will never, weigh in the favor of the business interest in this case, then you have to rely on consent. And if you want to rely on consent, the criticism is, well, you need to be both, clear and efficient and concise in how you disclose the processing activities, which, you could take up 2 hours trying to describe in detail all the processing activities. It's a complicated data flow, but you need to do that in a way that's clear and explicit and concise, but also give enough information so that the end user is informed and can make an informed decision. And that has always, I think, been the crux of the problem, that it seems almost impossible to both convey what's happening, all of the different purposes for which data is used, all of the different players the data is shared with, potentially in the data stream, all appending data, all of those activities that, you work in the space you're very familiar with, how to describe that in a way that's kind of clear and concise, and someone can click a button and say yes or no, and that consent can be informed. So I think I think there are ways to address the concern, but I don't know if that is possible in the way that the data flows today. So maybe that means fewer players can get access to information. That might be one potential option. Maybe there are fewer purposes. I think there's gonna have to be some shift, because I think that's the crux. We have an information problem here. I think that's what it boils down to.
Yeah, I think what has happened in the last couple of years is that a lot of online activity, advertising wise, sort of has been consolidated into the sort of real-time bidding auction, open to hundreds of players view. And that's not a model that everyone likes, right? A lot of publishers don't like it. They feel that it's commodified their inventory. If there are only a few high value places to go, that's where you go and you spend money. When you can bid for the cheapest possible inventory and bring your own data and find those high value users on monkeyjumpingjokes.com site, that's obviously not wonderful, and a lot of leading publishers don't love it. On the other hand, there are more limited uses of data that are probably more important to the basics of online advertising. The ability to know whether a certain campaign has been effective at getting you users, getting you high value users, right? That doesn't necessarily need spewing your data to hundreds of partners, but it does need, right, a chain of the user saw an ad, the user clicked, the user didn't click, but yet transacted. And for, business models, obviously, like, maybe gaming or others where a lot of it's free, a small number of users spend a lot of money, or other areas where the ROI is really dependent on whether you should spend more, there is a lot of, tracking going on. And you could see a system that was designed with controls and so forth that supported some of those activities, but maybe not the ones, and maybe a legitimate interest test, especially if you were doing more to pseudonymize, doing more to put limits, tougher rules around sensitive data, special category data. You can see ways to perhaps support core elements and not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think, unfortunately, the industry has been defined by the bathwater, right? And that's made all these pressures to where, analytics and more limited uses of data, are running into the same sort of buzzsaw of we need to, ban that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and you're right, because the commentary on legitimate interest was specific to behavioral advertising. And I think you make an argument, analytics is not behavioral advertising, right? It supports it. It's behind it on measurement, the attribution, but it's not the targeting itself, right? It's not the tracking itself. And if you can carve some of that out, you can still save some really important business uses. But there are others who will argue, well, we still need to do some element of tracking. And so how does that happen? And I think that's going to be where some of the work gets done, maybe in the next 6 months, to figure out what that looks like.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to minimize. Yes, it does mean tracking and data about a user across many sites. It's very often the same data, maybe less players if we say it's not going to go to 1,000. So, not completely simple, but you're at least perhaps in a more serious conversation about having controls and having more oversight and more auditing. Look, I think the industry also shot itself in the foot in that it's clear that most regulators require a clear consent upfront for the setting of that identifier and that initial bit. And many companies do that. Many do not. And I think that's also what has undermined some of the trust in that, the actors who wanted to have a higher standard often had a hard time, because you could get more and other inventory from others who only had a lot of inventory because it wasn't clearly consented. And so, I wish that we could empower sort of our self-regulatory organizations, the watchdogs who, could and should be pressing for compliance before it comes into this. And NAI does audits, and the IAB, I guess, IAB Europe is building more of a program, but we are 20 years into this. But then let me blame my regulator friends. I rolled out behavioral advertising at DoubleClick in the Parliament building with the UK Information Commissioner 20 years ago. I rolled it out in Germany with a penguin who taught people what ads were. Regulators didn't just wake up and discover that this system exists. And these laws are not unique to GDPR. Yes, some of the consent pieces of it became much more specific because of the interplay between e-privacy and GDPR. But most of what we're talking about has been already subject to the previous national legislative system, the Data Protection Directive. And yes, plenty have said, well, I don't think it's legal. But you know what? When for 25 years, an entire system gets built, and some regulators are saying, well, okay, have a policy and have an opt-out. And others are like, well, I think it's illegal, but I'm certainly not actively shutting it down. Then it's a societal problem, right? It's not just a bunch of rogues. It's the entire industry, every publisher, every newspaper, every government agency, every politician, right? And so if we're going to change the rules, right, and maybe we should, right? Well, wait, this is a problem. Then we need an orderly transition. And certainly the writing's been on the wall. Here's what I'm going to worry about. I'll tell you what I'm worried about. Clearly, because of what the platforms are doing as well, where much of what everyone is arguing about is going to, in large part, go away when the end of cookies comes upon us, when perhaps Android follows the path that iOS has set with requiring an opt-in very specifically upfront for those identifiers. So the writing is on the wall today, yesterday, last year for the current ecosystem. And if everyone knew that, and that was clear, I trust that all the super smart, innovative people would be like, okay, that's illegal, can't do it. Okay, how am I going to make money, right? We're all spending time online. Advertisers need to be there. Decisions need to be made about where you put the ads and how and so forth. And all the smart people will come up with all the new sophisticated ways, hopefully now following the new rules. But when we're not there, now maybe we just got there, right? I'd argue that between this decision, between Google's eventual changes with its sandbox, between what Apple did, which Google likely will follow, it's clear that the current status quo is over. And but given that not everybody sees that yet, there's still going to be this pain and suffering, and now the good guys can't move forward and say, okay, we're now going to this new model because they're still competing with the old practices. Have I been out of day-to-day practice too long? Am I pontificating here, or is this real for people who are, sitting down and asking you for advice and saying, what do I do? What do I do?
I think it's very real. I agree. The writing has been on the walls. There's an odd inertia, right? There's an acknowledgement. I spoke in front of, like, not lawyers, in front of ad tech business people a couple of years ago. I was like, these things are coming. Like, the thing to do is to get ahead of it. Don't be the company left behind scrambling to get on top of it. There's some runway here, but you can look ahead and read the tea leaves. And there hasn't been as much movement. There's been some, like, let's not say there's not been some. I do think there's attention being paid and there's innovation happening. But it's happened much more slowly than anticipated. And, it's clear things are going to change, but I also get some encouragement. Well, maybe encouragement's not the right word, but regulators also seem to have some inertia as well. Right? Because if we look at 2019 and the ICO's investigation and the Cannell's investigation into real-time bidding, there seems to be this thought of, this doesn't quite work with how our laws are set up, but we're not ready to kind of bring the hammer down yet. So we have this sort of like slow chipping away. And that's what's happening, right? There's a slow chipping away. The platforms come in, they have a massive chipping away, but it's still like chips happening. It's not kind of like a complete implosion. And that's probably a good thing, but it's still the time. The time was a couple of years ago. If it's not a couple of years ago, it's today to look up and say, this is clearly a change is happening and we need to kind of get on top of it very quickly because the time is running out.
I just warn the folks who sort of look at what's going on and say, oh, it's about the platforms just being anti-competitive and this and that. And, who knows what's deep in someone's brain. But if I was sitting over at, a browser, an operating system, and I saw, as they certainly do, all of this legislative and legal pressure, which they are the base of and participants in, of course you start moving to a next step, right? And I think too many people say, wait, but how are you treating yourself? Okay, fine. Let's demand that you treat yourself, the same way you treat everybody else, right? But, stirring up that noise as opposed to saying, hey, I want to be part of the solution. And I have a better idea. I don't like your idea for the solution because I think it favors this model, that model. Great. And I think, frankly, some of the really active activity in the Google sandbox, in the W3C, where you do have lots of folks saying, thanks for queuing that up, or maybe no thanks, but okay, now here's how I would like to change this. And I really hope that regulators and privacy advocates, who've sort of been more the bomb throwers on it, not good enough. Say, okay, then help figure out what is the future. Yes, contextual is part of it, but it's not the full story. You know what the context of the front page of the New York Times is today? I don't know. It's like war in Ukraine. What context do you want to put in the will Russia invade Ukraine? Exactly what are you going to be selling there, right? Gas masks or something, context doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Now, they actually have a lot of registered paying users, so they will actually have more information, but a lot of people won't, right? So figuring out, I think, is going to be complex. Let's come back to the US. Is this, look, at the end of the day, a lot of companies won't, you know why they won't change? EU is a big market. The US is the market and the bulk of the revenue today for many, many of these companies. The EU is their second market, and they may cry over losing that, but their bread and butter is the US market. Are we headed in the US in the same direction with potential restrictions on advertising?
Yes, although I suspect it might come at a similar pace of a slow chip as opposed to a big, kind of explosion, right? Like we might see restraints around the use of sensitive data categories or certain types of activities. But, if you look at, we had CCPA and the restrictions on sale. And when that was first released, there was a lot of concern about what that would do to the industry. And I think if you look up, 2 years later, it's the platform changes that have really had the more significant impact on the industry. And so I think you'll see, there's a banning surveillance advertising act that was introduced recently. There was the FTC petition asking them to do rulemaking on banning surveillance advertising. We've seen the Biden administration talk about it. We've got Lena Khan at the head of the FTC. There's a lot of energy and activity, I think, around, quote, the word I hate, surveillance advertising, and trying to find a way to put an end to it. But I think the practical reality is that those efforts will take some time and won't be able to, because of the business value. Like you'll see some people who will say contextual advertising, put a billboard up, let's go back to 1965, whatever, advertising, and that just doesn't seem realistic. So I think we're going to have to balance these kind of business interests with some of the concerns. I think you'll go to the more significant concerns, like I said, around sensitive health, before you see just sort of a full tearing down. So it'll be a slow chip. Well, my prediction is it'll be a slow chip, similar to what we saw in the EU.
When I saw the bill introduced to ban surveillance advertising, the first thing I did, of course, I went to the campaign websites of the three leading sponsors. Two of them very clearly disclose that they do behavioral advertising and target and retarget people who visit their sites. I'm like, wait, I thought you're banning this evil, deceptive, terrible thing. Sounds like you do this. And you might even have those ads up today, which if you think they're toxic and terrible, you probably shouldn't. So what's going on there? Is this a little bit of a performance? Oh, the third didn't actually have any privacy policy on their campaign site whatsoever, although did, it seems, have ad targeting related cookies. So come on, what's going on, right?
Did you see the language? I mean, like it's the worst thing happening to society, this concept of surveillance advertising. And, you know, it's not to downplay the concerns, but the way they were speaking about it did feel very like some political theater that was being put on. And, you know, that's just not really an efficient way to target a problem. So
yeah, and look, if they believe it, why are they doing it, right? I mean, it's one thing when journalists work at media. So, well, I don't really like how my newspaper makes money with ads, but I'm telling you what's wrong. I'm not. I report on the toxic waste. I'm not responsible for what the owner of the paper, is doing. So okay, whatever. But I don't know if you're a politician and you literally are paying for what you are. What's your take on this? I've been saying to people that. Yeah, you can focus on the way CCPA and the state laws that are focusing on behavioral ad opt-outs and special category data and do not restrictions on sale. At the federal level, my argument is that that's not what it's going to be all about. And the preemption and the private right are, yes, there's a political negotiation that needs to be had there. The important issue that we really need to figure out and we need to get right, and which the Biden administration actually cares about when you look at what OSTP and NTIA are focused on, are the issues around race, equity, discrimination, civil rights. The civil rights groups have said, from the National Leadership Conference to others, that what they care about, they see privacy as a civil right. They see risk to the historically protected rights around housing and employment being at risk because you're just optimizing a banner ad. You don't even know where and why. But meanwhile, as a result, somebody isn't getting targeted for an employment ad or the like. And clearly, that's something everyone agrees, I would like to think. We need to get right. We don't want to lose or harm, civil rights. But it's also a bit complicated because, creating a disparate impact test, perhaps because an algorithm, optimizes content when you may not even know who you're treating because you don't have race, you don't have the information. That's a hard, we got to solve that. But I think that's what's going to hold up or solve or not solve the privacy legislation. And I speak from having lots of conversations with the folks on the Hill. They don't think the preemption and the private right is the issue anymore. They know where they are. They know someone's going to have to compromise if something gets done. There's not a lot of intellectual debate. Here, there are complicated debates about how to do this right.
Yeah, they're complicated debates. And even if you agree in concept, I think in practice, those conversations become more challenging. And in our current political environment, I've just kind of gone back to the practical. If you look at our current political environment, getting legislation like this passed to me seems extremely challenging and not, I want to say impossible, but I just don't see the current configuration kind of coming to a middle ground or a meeting place on these points. And I think those are the issues. Like that's when we're talking about sensitive information, I include those categories, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and the impact on those communities. I put that into where we should have our focus, right? I think if you're in one space, you hear a lot about the targeting and ads and kind of, the consumer side of things. But I think this space is where the real harm is. And this is where more time needs to be spent.
Yeah, and if we got this right, and it actually probably has a bigger effect on society, it might also take some pressure off some of the, if we really can say nothing bad's going to happen other than you're going to get a personalized ad. Today, people credibly can say, no, you're going to get an ad that, is based on sensitive information, treats you differently, could risk harm. If we take those issues off the table by providing strong protections, it provides more room to have a legitimate debate about digital targeting. Let's talk for a minute
right? Then we can get back to the place where it's just ads or not.
Let's get back to yelling about cookies instead of like undermining society. Yes. In the minute or two we have left, I wanted to talk a little bit about you, because not only you're an amazing lawyer, as I've gotten to know you over the last couple of years, you're a pretty amazing person. You ran your what number marathon recently? Third marathon. So awesome, inspiring. But you also spend time, in addition to being on the FPF advisory board, where we are delighted to have your advising and thoughts and friendship. You serve on a couple of boards, some of which, well, let's give a shout out so people can maybe learn and hear a little bit more about both what you do as well as these organizations. I'm a Brooklyn Knight, and I grew up and was in elected office in Coney Island in Brooklyn. I know you're on the very active with Weeksville. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm the vice chair of the board of the Weeksville Heritage Center. So that is in Weeksville, which is an area in Brooklyn. And it's actually one of the first areas populated by free Blacks in America. And it's significant because in order to get the right to vote, you had to own land. So while there was a right to vote, you had to own land. And so this community came together, pooled their money, and bought land in this area of Brooklyn so that they would have the right. And so it's great because some of the homes, some of those original homes have been preserved, but the goal is to kind of preserve the legacy of this area. And because we're still in a space where social justice and economic justice, even food justice, still continue to be concerns, the organization has served as a cultural institution that's preserving the legacy, but also pulling that legacy into today. And it holds, things like open markets for Black-owned businesses. It has green markets where a lot of Black farms are able to share their food with the Weeksville community. It has an art space, so it preserves cultural legacy as well. So it's a really great, from a historical and current perspective, it's a really great institution.
Awesome. And so it's really more than a local organization, right? Because it's highlighting this key, historical issue and using art and culture to help make the much broader point as well. So if folks are interested, please, Nancy and team here posted a link. Go take a look at the Weeksville Society and see what they're doing. If you're in the New York area, support them. If you're not, really important organization. And you are also active with Musicians on Call.
Yes. So Musicians on Call is an organization that brings music to the bedside of patients. There's been a lot of research done about the importance of music in the healing process. And obviously, we've just spent 2 years going through a pandemic. And this organization has been really active in using music as a tool for healing. And I was brought on the board within the last year because they're creating something called MOC Connect, where they, the challenge is obviously getting into the hospitals. And so trying to build a platform that will help them reach people who are in, say, rural communities that are harder to get to, or it might not be as easy to connect a musician to a local hospital. But they come to the bedsides of patients. But what's also really lovely is that they come to the bedsides, or I won't say bedsides, but they also perform for people who work in the hospital. So all of the nurses and doctors who really at this time need that kind of uplifting. So it's lovely to see they share videos with us from time to time of the experience that either the kids who are patients or adults who are working in the hospital have. Just having like a little bit of levity to their day becomes really important.
Well, given your busy practice and the fact that you spend time with these organizations, I'm delighted that you spend time with the Future Privacy Forum and participate in our activities, and that I grabbed you for a little bit of time today. I hope people got to know this incredibly interesting leader of our space a little bit better. Thank you for your comments and insights. Have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully before too long. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Bye all.